The restaurant was buzzing with the usual lunchtime crowd. Clinking glasses, the hum of conversations, and the occasional laugh filled the air, creating the lively symphony of a popular dining spot. At one corner table, a woman sat quietly, her demeanor calm, but her presence striking. She didn't dress like someone who sought attention, yet there was something about her that made people glance her way. Her aura was one of quiet confidence, though her simplicity was disarming. She was waiting for someone, or so it seemed, sipping water while scrolling absent-mindedly through her phone. The waiter assigned to her table seemed less than thrilled. He barely looked at her when she arrived, tossing a menu onto the table without so much as a smile. To anyone paying attention, it was clear she wasn't receiving the same courteous service as the other diners. Perhaps it was the way she looked, or maybe it was something else entirely, but his attitude was unmistakably cold. As the minutes passed, his behavior grew increasingly dismissive. When she finally tried to order, his tone was clipped, almost rude, and he interrupted her more than once. "You sure you can afford that?" he asked with a smirk as she pointed to a dish. Her polite smile faltered for a moment, but she didn't react. Instead, she nodded and calmly confirmed her order. Other diners nearby exchanged glances, sensing the tension. Some whispered to each other, wondering why the waiter was acting this way. The woman remained composed, but it was clear the remarks had landed. Each time the waiter returned to her table, he brought with him a barely concealed sneer, muttering comments under his breath that were just loud enough for her to hear. "People like you don't usually come here. Must be a special day," he said when he brought her drink. The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded. It was impossible to ignore, and a few nearby patrons looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. What the waiter didn't know, however, was that this wasn't just any woman. She wasn't some random customer passing through, nor was she someone to be underestimated. Beneath her quiet exterior was a story that would turn the tables in a way no one in the restaurant could have predicted. The woman's patience seemed endless as she endured the treatment without lashing out. But those who watched closely could see that she was taking mental notes, her calm exterior hiding a storm brewing underneath. When the waiter delivered her meal, he made another cutting remark. And this time, she looked him directly in the eye. Her gaze was steady, and for a moment, the smirk on his face faltered. There was something about her that hinted she wasn't as powerless as he thought. Then, just as the woman began to eat, a man in a tailored suit entered the restaurant. His presence immediately commanded attention. He moved with the assurance of someone who belonged, scanning the room until his eyes landed on her. A warm smile spread across his face as he approached her table. The waiter, noticing the man's entrance, suddenly straightened his posture, his earlier smugness replaced with nervous energy. It was clear this man was important, and the waiter knew it. The man greeted the woman with familiarity, leaning down to give her a quick kiss on the cheek before sitting across from her. They exchanged a few words, their conversation inaudible over the restaurant noise. But their connection was obvious. The waiter's face drained of color as realization began to dawn. His eyes darted between the woman and the man, panic creeping in as he pieced together who she might be. The next moments were a whirlwind. The man called over the restaurant manager, speaking in low but firm tones. The manager's expression shifted from confusion to alarm as he listened, occasionally glancing at the waiter, who now stood frozen in place, his earlier arrogance replaced with visible fear. Patrons nearby strained to catch bits of the conversation, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. What had started as an ordinary lunch had now turned into something much more. All eyes were on the table, the once dismissive waiter now the subject of everyone's curiosity and growing judgment. And as the truth about the woman's identity began to emerge, the entire restaurant braced for what would come next. The woman, who had remained poised throughout the ordeal, finally spoke. Her voice was calm but carried an unmistakable authority. Whatever she said made the manager's face flush with embarrassment, and the waiter looked like he wanted to disappear. The crowd waited with bated breath, sensing that this story was far from over. Little did they know, The biggest revelation was yet to come. The man leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful as he observed the unfolding drama. He seemed to be gauging the reactions around him, watching the manager shuffle uncomfortably and the waiter's demeanor crumble under the weight of the moment. Meanwhile, the woman remained composed, her presence becoming more commanding with every passing second. It was clear now that her silence had been deliberate, a choice made to let the situation reach its boiling point before stepping in. As murmurs spread through the restaurant, a couple seated at a nearby table exchanged knowing looks. One of them leaned closer to whisper, "I've seen her before. Isn't she connected to the owner somehow?" Their words hung in the air, adding fuel to the speculation already brewing among the diners. Across the room, another patron discreetly took out their phone, pretending to check messages but clearly recording the unfolding scene. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation as everyone waited to see what would happen next. The woman's quiet strength made the waiter's earlier behavior seem even more glaring in hindsight. He had underestimated her, assuming she was someone he could mistreat without consequence. Now, standing under the watchful eyes of both the manager and the man in the suit, he looked like a deer caught in headlights. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead as he fumbled for words, trying to explain himself, but the weight of his actions seemed to choke off any coherent response. The manager, clearly flustered, stammered out an apology directed at the woman. "I'm so sorry for this misunderstanding," he began, his voice shaky. But the woman held up a hand, silencing him mid-sentence. Her calm yet firm gesture carried more authority than any raised voice could have. The room fell silent once again as she leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto the waiter with an intensity that made him shrink back. "Do you treat all your customers this way, or was today special?" she asked, her tone even but piercing. The question wasn't loud, but it carried across the room, each word landing like a carefully aimed arrow. The waiter's mouth opened and closed as he struggled to find an answer, but no words came. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint clinking of cutlery as a few diners nervously resumed eating, unsure of what else to do. The man in the suit finally spoke, his voice steady and authoritative. "I think it's time we address what happened here," he said, glancing first at the manager and then at the waiter. "It's not just about an apology. It's about accountability." His words carried weight, and the manager's nods became more frantic as he realized the seriousness of the situation. Meanwhile, the waiter's face turned a shade paler, his earlier bravado now completely gone. As the confrontation continued, the woman remained a picture of grace, her calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the chaos her presence had caused. It was becoming increasingly clear to everyone in the restaurant that she wasn't just an ordinary customer. But who was she? And what role did she play in the story that was rapidly unfolding? The answers remained just out of reach, tantalizingly close but still shrouded in mystery. And as the tension in the room reached a fever pitch, one thing was certain. The truth, when it finally came out, would change everything. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath as the tension thickened. The woman, calm and composed as ever, let her gaze linger on the waiter, her silence carrying more weight than any words she could have spoken. The man in the suit shifted slightly, his presence a quiet but powerful reminder of the authority he carried. The manager, visibly uncomfortable, fumbled with his hands, his eyes darting between the woman, the man, and the waiter as though searching for some way to diffuse the situation. The waiter's confidence had crumbled entirely. He stood stiffly, his arms awkwardly at his sides, his usual smirk replaced with a strained expression. His earlier actions, dismissive and full of thinly veiled contempt, now loomed over him like a storm cloud. It was clear he hadn't anticipated this moment. To him, she had likely seemed like someone insignificant, someone who wouldn't dare push back against his behavior. But now, under the scrutiny of the room, his arrogance had turned to shame. The woman finally spoke again, her voice soft but resolute. "Do you think it's acceptable to treat people this way?" she asked, her tone devoid of anger, but filled with an unshakable authority. The waiter's mouth opened as if to respond, but no words came out. His face flushed, and he averted his eyes, the weight of her question pressing down on him. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that made everyone in the room feel its gravity. The man in the suit leaned forward slightly, his sharp gaze fixed on the manager. "It seems there's a pattern here," he said, his tone cool and deliberate. "Is this how you train your staff? To belittle and insult your customers?" The manager's face turned a deeper shade of red, and he began to stammer. "No, of course not. This is an isolated incident," he said, his voice shaking. But the words rang hollow, and everyone in the room could feel it. The manager's attempts to minimize the situation only served to highlight the severity of what had happened. The tension in the room was palpable. Some of the other diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others watched with barely concealed curiosity, their eyes darting between the woman, the man, and the waiter. A few whispered quietly among themselves, their words lost in the hum of the room, but their expressions betraying a mix of disbelief and intrigue. The story unfolding before them was unlike anything they'd expected when they walked into the restaurant that day. The waiter, desperate to salvage what was left of his dignity, finally found his voice. "I didn't mean any harm," he mumbled, his words barely audible. He looked at the woman, his eyes pleading for forgiveness. I was having a bad day. It wasn't personal." The excuse hung in the air, flimsy and unconvincing. The woman's expression didn't change. She didn't respond right away, letting his words linger in the space between them. When she finally spoke, her tone was steady and measured. "A bad day doesn't give you the right to disrespect people," she said. Her words were simple, but they carried an undeniable truth. The waiter's shoulders slumped, and he looked down at the floor, unable to meet her gaze. The man in the suit nodded, as if to emphasize her point, and turned back to the manager. "This is bigger than just today," he said. "If this is how your staff feels they can treat customers, then it speaks to a deeper issue in how this place is run." The manager swallowed hard, his discomfort evident. He nodded quickly, his hands wringing together nervously. "You're absolutely right," he said. "This is unacceptable, and I'll make sure it's addressed immediately." His words came out in a rush, as though he were trying to say everything at once to appease them. But the woman didn't seem entirely convinced. She glanced at the man across from her, their silent exchange suggesting a shared understanding that this wasn't over. As the minutes ticked by, the atmosphere in the restaurant grew more charged. The other diners couldn't look away, their meals forgotten as they watched the drama unfold. The whispers grew louder, speculation spreading like wildfire. "Who is she?" someone murmured. "She must be important," another replied. The curiosity in the room was palpable, but no one dared to approach the table to ask directly. The mystery of her identity only added to the tension, leaving everyone on edge as they waited to see what would happen next. The woman took a sip of her water, her movements unhurried despite the weight of the moment. Her calm demeanor only added to her air of authority, making it clear that she was in control of the situation. She turned her attention back to the waiter, her gaze steady. "Have you ever thought about how your words and actions affect others?" she asked. The question was pointed, but her tone was almost gentle, as though she genuinely wanted him to reflect on his behavior. The waiter didn't respond right away. His face was a mix of embarrassment and regret, and for the first time, he seemed to be grappling with the consequences of his actions. I didn't think about it," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong. I'm sorry." The apology hung in the air, and for a moment, it seemed as though the tension might ease. But the woman's expression remained unchanged, her eyes searching his face, as though trying to determine whether his regret was genuine. Before the manager could finish, the restaurant's front door opened again. The quiet jingle of the bell drew everyone's attention, and the room fell silent as the woman and the man walked back in. The energy in the space shifted immediately, the hum of conversation replaced by an almost tangible sense of anticipation. All eyes were on them as they moved with purpose toward the center of the room. The manager froze mid-sentence, his face draining of color. The waiter's head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. The woman stopped, her gaze sweeping across the room. She seemed to take in every face, every expression, as though silently acknowledging the collective weight of what had transpired. The man beside her stood tall, his presence commanding, but it was clear she was the one leading this moment. "There's something else you all need to know," she said, her voice steady but carrying enough authority to make everyone listen. The silence was deafening as she continued. "This isn't just about me or about what happened today. It's about a culture that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked." Her words were direct, cutting through the lingering tension like a knife. "But here's what you might not realize," she added, her tone shifting slightly. "This restaurant means more to me than you could possibly imagine, and I won't stand by and watch it be tarnished by actions like these." The revelation hung in the air, its implications dawning on everyone in the room. The whispers started almost immediately, disbelief spreading like wildfire. "What does she mean?" One diner murmured, Is she connected to the owner?" Another asked, their voice barely above a whisper. The woman let the murmurs continue for a moment, as though giving everyone time to process. Then, with a calm yet firm tone, she delivered the truth that no one had seen coming. "I'm not just any customer," she said, her gaze locking onto the manager. "I'm the owner's wife." The words landed like a thunderclap, sending a shockwave through the room. Gasps of surprise rippled among the diners, and even the staff looked stunned. The manager's face turned an even deeper shade of red, and the waiter's knees seemed to buckle slightly as he clutched the edge of a nearby table for support. The weight of her revelation was impossible to ignore. The woman's calm demeanor, her quiet authority, and her unshakable resolve now made perfect sense. She wasn't just a customer standing up against mistreatment. She was someone with a personal stake in the restaurant, someone who had every reason to demand accountability. The man in the suit, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. "And he said, his voice steady and commanding, "am the co-owner." The room erupted into a flurry of murmurs and whispers, the combined weight of their identities hitting everyone at once. The diners who had been quietly recording the earlier confrontation now scrambled to capture this new development, their phones held discreetly but unmistakably in their hands. The staff exchanged nervous glances, their earlier unease now magnified tenfold. The woman's gaze shifted back to the waiter, who looked as though he wanted to disappear. "You thought you could get away with treating people this way," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "But today, you've learned an important lesson. Everyone deserves respect, no matter who they are or what you assume about them." Her words were measured, each one carrying the weight of someone who had seen more than she let on. The manager, who had been standing frozen in place, finally found his voice. I had no idea," he stammered, his words tumbling out in a rush. "If I'd known." He trailed off, realizing too late that his excuse only made things worse. The man in the suit raised a hand, silencing him. "That's precisely the problem," he said. "You shouldn't need to know someone's identity to treat them with respect. This isn't just about us. It's about the culture you've allowed to develop here." The tension in the room was almost unbearable as the couple's words sank in. The diners watched with bated breath, their curiosity mingling with a growing sense of admiration. It wasn't every day that someone so directly challenged the status quo, and it was clear that this moment would leave a lasting impact. But even as the woman and the man stood in the center of the room, their authority undeniable, it felt as though there was still more to come. The woman turned to the manager, her expression softening slightly. "This restaurant has always been about community," she said, "about creating a space where everyone feels welcome. That's what my husband and I built together, and it's what we'll continue to uphold. But it starts with accountability. And that means making sure this never happens again." Her words carried a quiet strength, and the manager nodded quickly, his earlier defensiveness giving way to genuine remorse. "Of course," he said, "I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." The woman studied him for a moment, as though weighing the sincerity of his promise. Then she nodded, her expression resolute. "Good," she said, "because this isn't just about today. It's about the future." As the couple prepared to leave once again, the atmosphere in the restaurant remained electric. The other diners couldn't tear their eyes away, their earlier curiosity now mingling with a sense of awe. The waiter, still standing near the table, looked utterly defeated, his earlier arrogance replaced with a deep sense of regret. And as the woman and the man walked toward the door, it was clear that their presence had left an indelible mark on everyone in the room. But just as they reached the exit, the woman paused. She turned back, her gaze sweeping across the room one last time. "Remembered," she said, her voice carrying the weight of everything that had happened. "Respect isn't optional. It's the foundation of everything we do." With that, she stepped outside, the man following close behind. The door closed behind them, leaving the restaurant in stunned silence. And though the immediate confrontation was over, the impact of their words lingered, setting the stage for what was still to come. The restaurant remained in an uneasy quiet after the couple's departure, but the tension in the air was almost palpable. The diners exchanged glances, whispering to one another, while the staff tried to collect themselves. The manager immediately instructed the staff to gather in the kitchen, leaving the diners to continue their murmurs. Inside the kitchen, the atmosphere was tense. The manager looked at the waiter who had caused the scene, his face a mix of frustration and uncertainty. This is beyond unacceptable," the manager started, his voice shaking slightly. "I don't even know where to begin. But one thing is clear, there will be changes. And it starts now." The waiter stood with his head lowered, clearly understanding the weight of what he'd done. For the first time, he looked genuinely remorseful, his usual cocky demeanor completely stripped away. Before the manager could finish addressing the staff, the door to the kitchen opened. The couple had returned. Their presence was like a sudden charge of electricity, cutting through the building tension like lightning. The woman's gaze swept over the gathered staff, her expression calm but firm. "We came back," she said, her voice steady, "because there's still something that needs to be addressed." The manager visibly tensed, his earlier resolve seeming to falter. The woman's gaze settled on him. "I know you want to fix this," she continued, "but we need to ensure that what happened today isn't just swept under the rug. This isn't just about one person's actions. It's about the environment that allowed it to happen." Her words hung heavy in the air, and the staff exchanged uneasy glances. The man, who had remained silent until now, finally stepped forward. "We've decided to take immediate action," he announced. "This restaurant has a reputation for excellence, not just in food, but in how we treat people. And we're going to make sure it stays that way." He turned to the manager. "You've been with us for years," he said, "but somewhere along the way, something changed. And we need to address that." The manager nodded, looking like he wanted to argue but thought better of it. "You're right," he admitted, his voice quiet. "I've let things slide that I shouldn't have. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." The man gave him a long, measuring look before nodding. "That's a start," he said. The woman's attention shifted to the waiter, who looked as though he wanted to disappear into the floor. "And as for you," she began, her tone unyielding, "there's no place for behavior like yours in this restaurant, or anywhere else for that matter. People deserve to be treated with respect, no matter what you think you know about them." The waiter opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. Instead, he simply nodded, his face pale and his eyes downcast. The woman turned back to the rest of the staff. "This is a wake-up call for all of us," she said. "We need to do better. And we will. But it's going to take all of us working together to make that happen." Her words were met with a mixture of solemn nods and murmured agreements. Just as it seemed the confrontation had reached its conclusion, a sudden movement near the entrance caught everyone's attention. A young woman, who had been dining alone during the earlier incident, stepped forward hesitantly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice wavering slightly. I just wanted to say something." The couple turned to face her, their expressions curious but open. The young woman took a deep breath before continuing. "I've been coming to this restaurant for years," she said, "and I've seen things that made me uncomfortable. But I never said anything, because I didn't think it would make a difference. But today, seeing what happened and how you handled it, it's made me realize that speaking up does matter." Her words seemed to resonate deeply, not just with the couple but with everyone present. The woman's expression softened, and she stepped forward. "Thank you for sharing that," she said. "It takes courage to speak up, and it's people like you who help create the change we need." The young woman smiled nervously but seemed relieved to have spoken her piece. As the couple prepared to leave once more, the woman turned back to the staff one last time. "Remember," she said, her voice carrying a note of finality, "this isn't just about today. It's about setting a standard for the future. Let's make sure we're proud of what we're building here." The couple's departure this time felt different. The tension in the air had lifted slightly, replaced by a sense of purpose. The staff began to disperse, each person clearly reflecting on the events of the day. The manager pulled the waiter aside for a private conversation, while the other employees started cleaning up the restaurant, their movements more deliberate than before. But just as the restaurant began to settle into a sense of normalcy, the young woman who had spoken up earlier noticed something unusual. She walked over to the table where the couple had been sitting and found a small envelope resting on the edge. Curious, she picked it up and opened it, her eyes widening as she read the contents. Inside was a handwritten note that read, "Thank you for your courage. Your voice matters more than you know. Use it." The note was signed simply with the couple's initials. The young woman's eyes filled with tears, and she clutched the note tightly. In that moment, she realized that the impact of the day's events would ripple far beyond the walls of the restaurant. And though the immediate conflict had been resolved, the message of respect, accountability, and courage would continue to resonate, inspiring change in ways no one could have anticipated. As the young woman held the note in her hands, a deep sense of gratitude washed over her. It wasn't just about the words written on the paper, it was about the validation, the acknowledgement that her voice had made a difference. She carefully tucked the note into her bag and glanced around the restaurant. The atmosphere, though still subdued, felt lighter, as if a collective understanding had settled over everyone present. People were quieter, more thoughtful, and even the staff moved with a renewed sense of purpose. The manager stepped out of the kitchen and approached the young woman. His expression was one of humility, his earlier frustration replaced with a genuine desire to make amends. "Thank you for speaking up earlier," he said, his voice sincere. "It's not easy to stand up like that, especially in a public setting. You've given me a lot to think about, and I want you to know that we're taking this seriously." The young woman nodded, feeling a mix of relief and hope. "I just want this to be a place where everyone feels welcome," she said. "It's always been one of my favorite spots, and I'd love to see it thrive for the right reasons." The manager gave her a small, grateful smile. "That's exactly what we're aiming for, and I promise we'll make the changes needed to ensure it happens." Meanwhile, outside the restaurant, the couple sat in their car, watching the scene unfold through the large front windows. The woman leaned back in her seat, her expression a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. "It's not easy, holding people accountable," she said, her voice soft. "But it's necessary. I just hope they take this as a chance to grow." The man reached over and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "They will," he said confidently. "We've set the stage for change, and now it's up to them to follow through." As they sat in companionable silence, the man's phone buzzed with a notification. He glanced at it and chuckled softly. "It looks like word is already spreading," he said, holding up his phone to show her. Someone had posted a video of the earlier confrontation, and it was quickly gaining traction online. The comments were filled with support for the couple's actions, with many praising them for taking a stand against injustice. The woman sighed but smiled. "Well, if it helps spread the message, then I'm all for it," she said. "But I hope the focus stays on the bigger picture and not just the drama." Back inside, the waiter who had caused the initial conflict approached the manager with a tentative expression. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know what I did was wrong, and I'll accept whatever consequences come my way." The manager studied him for a moment before nodding. "Apologizing is a good start," he said, "but actions speak louder than words. If you're serious about making amends, it'll take more than just saying the right things." The waiter nodded, his face serious. "I'll do better," he promised. "I don't want this to define me." As the evening wore on, the restaurant slowly began to return to its usual rhythm. The remaining diners finished their meals, some stopping to thank the manager or the young woman on their way out. The staff worked diligently, their interactions tinged with a newfound sense of camaraderie. It was clear that the events of the day had left an indelible mark, and while there was still much work to be done, the first steps toward change had been taken. Later that night, as the restaurant closed and the last of the staff went home, the manager lingered in the empty dining room. He looked around at the quiet space, reflecting on the day's events. He thought about the couple's words, the young woman's courage, and the way the staff had responded. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of hope. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but it was possible. And that was enough. The couple, meanwhile, sat together in their living room, their earlier exhaustion giving way to quiet contentment. The woman leaned her head against the man's shoulder, her eyes closed. "Do you think they'll follow through?" she asked softly. He wrapped an arm around her, his voice steady. "I think we gave them the tools to start," he said. "The rest is up to them." She nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "I hope they do. For their sake, and for everyone who walks through those doors." The video of the confrontation continued to gain traction online, sparking discussions about respect, accountability, and the importance of standing up against injustice. People from all walks of life shared their thoughts, their own stories, and their hopes for a more inclusive and understanding world. The couple chose not to engage with the viral moment directly, preferring to let the message speak for itself. For them, it wasn't about the attention. It was about the change they hoped to inspire. In the weeks that followed, the restaurant underwent noticeable changes. The manager implemented new training programs focused on customer service and inclusivity. The staff worked together to create a more welcoming environment, and the overall atmosphere improved significantly. Regular customers began to notice and appreciate the efforts, and even new patrons were quick to comment on the positive energy in the space. The young woman who had spoken up that day became a frequent visitor, her quiet courage serving as a reminder of the power of one voice. The waiter, true to his word, worked hard to rebuild trust with both his colleagues and the diners. While it wasn't an easy road, his efforts didn't go unnoticed. Over time, he proved that change was possible, even for those who had made serious mistakes. As for the couple, they continued to visit the restaurant from time to time, always observing from a distance to see how things were progressing. Each visit brought a sense of pride and satisfaction, knowing that their actions had helped spark a transformation. They remained humble, never drawing attention to themselves, but their presence was a quiet reminder of the values they stood for. The story of that day became something of a legend, not just within the restaurant, but in the community as a whole. It was a tale of accountability, courage, and the enduring power of respect. And though the immediate conflict had been resolved, the lessons learned continued to resonate, inspiring change far beyond the walls of the restaurant. In the end, it wasn't about who owned the restaurant or who had the power. It was about the people, the staff, the customers, and the community coming together to create something better. And that perhaps was the most important takeaway of all. Respect wasn't just a policy, it was a choice, a commitment to seeing the humanity in everyone. And as the couple drove away from the restaurant one last time, they knew that their work, though far from finished, had made a difference.